So let me get right on to introducing our speaker for today. Guy Marzorati is a reporter and producer for the KQED's California Politics and Government, based in San Jose. Guy joined KQED in 2013 and reports on state and local politics. He produces KQED's weekly radio show and podcast called Political Breakdown and KQED's Digital Voter Guide. Guy is a graduate of Santa Clara University. Give people a warm welcome to Guy Marzorati.
All right, thank you, everybody. Nice to see such a big turnout given the weather outside, and hello to everyone on Zoom. You all probably made a good business decision as well, given the state of the roads out there. So again, I'm Guy Marzorati. I work at KQED on our politics and government desk as a reporter and a producer. So maybe I'll start before I get into some of the top things I'm watching this year in the world of state and local politics, just a little bit about myself and the work we do at KQED. So our newsroom has a lot of different coverage hubs. One of them is politics and government, made up of myself and 3 other reporter, editors, and producers. And my work kind of breaks down into the reporting and producing bucket. So reporting is probably a little self-explanatory. I cover a lot of what's going on in local politics here in the Bay Area, largely centered around local elections. So last year was a very busy one. In addition to state government, state politics. So what you see on the ballot on the state level in terms of propositions and races, but then also in a year like this, what's happening at the state legislature. So we're all based in the Bay Area. Most of my colleagues are in San Francisco. I'm based in our San Jose office, but we all kind of tag team to cover what's going on at the state capitol to the best of our ability. So that's the reporting bucket. Then producing is kind of like what I do behind the scenes. So that's largely working on our politics show, Political Breakdown, which airs on Thursday nights, and you can subscribe to the podcast as well. So producing that, putting the show together every week, working on our different political segments that appear on shows across KQED, and then working on our guide. So this is largely our voter guide that comes out every election year for the primary and the general election. This year, we're super excited that we were able to expand that from how it started, which was traditionally a proposition guide, really looking at state measures, to this year, for the first time, we explored races and measures in every Bay Area county. So we're really trying to fill a gap that I think is sadly growing, which is in like local political coverage. There's just not as many local outlets that are following city councils, that are following mayor races, county races, even what's happening in Sacramento as it relates to our region. And so that's kind of where we come in and hope to, build an audience based on our coverage of state and local politics. So I can start a little bit, and I'll make sure to save time for questions at the end in case anyone has them. But you're also feel free to raise your hand, jump in if you have something pressing while I'm talking. But I'll just kind of go through the top things that myself and our team have been following this year when it comes to state as well as local politics. We came into 2023 exhausted, glad that we are not facing yet another election. It's been starting with 2020, and then the recalls on the state and local level in 2021, then our midterm election in 2022. It's been a bit of a nonstop kind of roller coaster of elections. We were looking forward to kind of a break from that in 2023, but lo and behold, the U.S. Senate race in California is already off to a start just 1 week into the year. So I anticipate, given the election calendar as it stands, I'll talk a little bit about that. The Senate race is going to heat up pretty quickly, and I think largely play out over the course of this year, 2023. We already saw this week Orange County Congresswoman Katie Porter get into the race, despite the fact that Dianne Feinstein really hasn't said it one way or another whether she's running. The only statement we've heard is that she welcomes people to throw their hat in the ring. I think at this point it's pretty unlikely that she'll pursue another 6-year term in the Senate. And I think it's why you're seeing candidates really not take the time to wait to hear from Dianne before they jump in. So we heard from Katie Porter this in the race. Many other House members are probably not that far behind. Adam Schiff in Los Angeles, Barbara Lee represents the East Bay and Oakland Congress, potentially Ro Khanna here in the South Bay, although he seems a little bit more undecided at this point. And I'm sure the field will grow because as we've seen, this is a really unprecedented opportunity in California politics. Einstein and Felter seat since 1992. Barbara Boxer held it from 92 until 2016. So it's had an opportunity to go from sitting in the House and serving in the Senate don't come around too often. So I think that's why you're going to see a pretty robust field. What stands out to me initially is the fact that everyone who's gotten in thus far or hinted at getting in is a Democrat. And I think you'd expect a really crowded field on the Democratic side. What that means is if the state Republican Party coalesce around a single candidate, which would take savvy and strategy, something we've seen a lot of in recent years from them, but you could absolutely, even in a top two primary, end up with a crowded Democratic field resulting in one Democrat and kind of the, as we've seen in recent years, the sacrificial lamb from the Republican Party advances to the November election. So that puts a lot of time pressure on campaigns, given that as of right now, the primary is back in March, will be at the beginning of March 2024. So there's not a lot of run-up. You're talking about having to build a campaign organization, in some cases, build an entire fundraising apparatus. You know, some folks like Adam Schiff have a lot of money in the bank, but that's not everybody. And I think it's going to be, you know, time of the essence to build that up this year. So you really have a crowded Democratic field potentially emerging, you know, this spring and this summer. And they could easily really divide up a lot of the constituencies that exist in the party. I think you could imagine a scenario in which someone like Barbara Lee or Will Connor is drawing on the voters who came out to support Bernie Sanders in the 2020 presidential primary here. You can see Adam Schiff probably lining himself more with voters who might be in the Dianne Feinstein kind of lane, given his kind of experience on intelligence committees and work in the House. And then there's natural ties between someone like Katie Porter and Elizabeth Warren. She's already come out and endorsed Katie Porter. Katie Porter was a former student of hers. So I think you can see kind of these lines dividing themselves in a similar way to how we saw the presidential primary play out in California, which again speaks to, you know, these candidates could really evenly divide up the electorate and pretty much ensure that only one Democrat potentially advances in November. Also, you know, because of that accelerated timeline, I think it's going to take a strong showing in terms of fundraising and getting name ID out there for a lot of these candidates before they have to decide ultimately in December of 2023 whether or not they're going to stay in this race. As you're seeing all of these candidates so far, commonality is they all serve in the House. They all would be up for election again in 2024. So this is not what we call a free run for the Senate. They would be basically giving up their seat in Congress to make this run. And so at a certain point, there has to be a reality check, you know, where they see their campaigns in terms of, you know, viability going into the summer, going into the fall. If it's not looking like they're going to be, you know, towards the top of the primary, it's a huge risk to stay in the race and give up their seat. That being said, the possibility of so many Congress members staying in this race has a lot of trickle-down effects. You could ultimately have open House seats in the East Bay and the South Bay and Orange County and Los Angeles, and then who's going to run for those House seats? Largely people who are serving in the state legislature. That then is going to create a trickle-down effect to vacancies in the state Senate and state assembly. So this stuff all moves pretty quickly. It's why you're already seeing just weeks after, you know, the new House members and the new legislature are sworn in, people are already starting to plan runs for 2024 based on what other candidates might do and how they might position themselves. So there's a lot of three-dimensional stress that's already kind of happening early in this year. For us, I think an early focus in our political reporting is going to be what's happening at the state legislature. Started with Governor Gavin Newsom, second term, and a lot of turnover happening in both the Senate and Assembly. I was just talking to Jackie about this, you know, between term limits, between the new maps that came out as part of our independent redistricting process. There's a lot of members who decided not to run, or decided to run in a different district, or decided to run for an office outside the legislature. So there's a whole lot of turnover on who's coming in both the state Senate and Assembly. That's created a lot of positives and a lot of opportunities in terms of new representation. We're seeing records amount of women serving in the state legislature. We're seeing just a lot of new faces come to Sacramento. That also affects the power dynamic as it relates to the governor's office and the legislature. You're having the legislature come into office in 2023 that has a lot less experience with things like the budget, the legislative process. And so I think that plays the advantage, since we're not really talking partisan lines here. Democrats control all the levers of government in Sacramento. You are seeing kind of a power shift maybe more towards the executive branch as Governor Gavin Newsom heads into a second term. The big news on Newsom's front is that after a lot of really good years of budget luck, that could be running out this year. He basically took office as California had come out of a recession. We kind of added our reserves through Proposition 2 and the rainy day funds, and the good times kind of kept rolling even through the pandemic. We're so reliant in our state on the on taxes paid through stocks, capital gains, that as the stock market kept going up through 2021, that reflected in record amount of surpluses, almost $100 billion of a surplus in last year's budget. Now that's all kind of slowing down. As the state economy slows down, as top earners are making less, that's directly reflected in how much money is rolling into the state budget. And it's why Newsom came out this week and said we're actually facing a $22.5 billion shortfall in this year's budget. Now, that sounds like a huge number, but given the size of California's budget, they're really able to pay for that over by moving money around between different funds, by delaying capital expenditure. So it's not, I don't get the sense in Sacramento right now that it's a dire situation at all. That's not to say there won't be immediate effects from the shortfall in terms of, childcare slots that parents thought would be coming available this year that won't, food benefits for undocumented immigrants that were supposed to roll out this year that might not. But overall, you're not getting the sense of that panic from interest groups and from Democrats in Sacramento yet. I think the real concern is that the economy worsens and we do end up in a recession, that then you're going to have to start to see major cuts to programs that right now aren't on the chopping block, like schools, education, health and human services, and then tapping the state's rainy day fund. Right now, Newsom is proposing not to do that. He basically decided the rainy day fund is around $20 billion. So you could see, okay, well, that's kind of around where the budget shortfall is right now, but it makes sense to just make it up in one fell swoop. I think he's looking out for the possibility that by May, when Californians have paid their taxes, when the governor has to come back to the legislature with an updated budget proposal, that we could be in a lot worse predicament. So that's certainly something that we'll be keeping an eye on in the early months of 2023, how state revenues are coming in, and kind of how that affects the budget conversation that happens in Sacramento. I will say, if you look at some of the early cuts that have been proposed, they're pretty strategic around places where California is getting money from other sources. And an example of that is climate investment and transportation. Those are the two big buckets that the Biden administration and the Democratic Congress was able to pass last year. And so I think the Newsom administration is kind of looking to those areas to get federal support and maybe not cut in areas like healthcare, like, free TK, childcare, where the federal government is not going to be providing that much support. So there is some strategy going into it so far. And ultimately, the governor in Sacramento drives the budget process. It's one of the areas where the legislature has the least amount of power. It's largely the Department of Finance, the governor, who, their expectations, their revenue projections are the ones that usually stick in the end. And even though we've seen in recent years the budget process kind of grind on past the statutory deadline in June, it's ultimately usually the governor's vision that gets enacted in the state budget. But we'll see in legislation as well. I mean, we even saw at the end of last year, Newsom veto a lot of spending that he might otherwise be expected to sign off on, because I think these storm clouds started gathering as far as our revenue outlook in California. So we'll definitely be watching out for that. I will say Newsom, when he made his budget presentation this week, the highlight was actually something that had nothing to do with the deficit. It was this this tirade that he's been on about spending on the local level as it relates to reducing homelessness. This will be, I think, the story to watch in Sacramento this year. It's to push and pull, the back and forth, whatever you want to call it, battle between the Newsom administration and local governments when it comes to funding that's been, sent out already to reduce homelessness. This is an area where for a very long time, California state government kind of stayed out of the way. going back to, the Reagan administration, when he was governor here, there's an investment in housing and affordable housing at the local level. You look at doing away with redevelopment during Jerry Brown's second time as governor. The state really stepped away from this, and it was not an issue that Jerry Brown was super interested in solving. I think you saw it in a lot of ways as a local issue. Newsom really shifted the paradigm on that in terms of investments coming from the state. Obviously, having a lot of money to spend at the state level made a difference, but the results haven't followed. I mean, he's been in office since the beginning of 2019. You've seen record budget after budget in terms of spending to reduce homelessness. And anyone here, we all live in the Bay Area, we see that things are not really improving. So I think this year you're going to really see more legislation around accountability on how that money is being spent. I think maybe some real sticks. We've had a lot of carrots. I think you're going to see pushes for legislation on not giving cities money for homelessness unless they're meeting certain metrics, or pulling funding from them when it comes to rewards on transportation or other things if they're not delivering in terms of reducing their unsheltered population, clearing encampments, etc. So that's something that, despite Newsom largely getting along with the Democratic majority in Sacramento, those state senators, those state assembly members, what they're hearing from back home is not going to be a really happy message when it comes to money getting cut for homelessness. So I think that's definitely going to be something to watch this year. And then the most immediate thing underway in Sacramento is the special session around oil prices. So Newsom hinted at this throughout his reelection campaign. Definitely saw this as a good issue to kind of position himself against the oil companies. And now we're yet to see kind of what this will manifest itself as, what the details are going to be. So far, it's looking like ideas to, number one, kind of set a cap on profits that oil companies can make before they have to start paying penalties to the state. And number two, setting a limit on how many refineries can undergo maintenance at once. This was an issue this fall. If you remember, there were multiple refineries around the state, and we have fewer and fewer of them that had maintenance going on at once that led to a price spike in October. So this is something that Newsom, again, will have to, win over the Democratic legislature that still has a pretty strong moderate bent in a lot of areas, and the oil industry spends pretty heavily, especially in elections where there are two Democrats. I think the oil industry in California, like the Chamber of Commerce, like other business groups, has really realigned itself in this era of Republican irrelevance. They've seen kind of how the political winds are shifting and the necessity on their end to really invest in moderate Democrats. So you see many top two general elections here in the state for state senate, state assembly, where you have the more moderate business-backed candidate largely drawing off of some impacts from oil companies, from energy companies, from Chamber of Commerce, often aligning themselves, often facing off against Democrats who have more labor-based or union-backed people-backed money. So how that's going to play out in this special session is you still do have a lot of Democrats who represent either oil drilling communities or even oil refinery communities. I was just interviewing the new assemblywoman from Solano County, Lori Wilson, yesterday, and she represents an area in Benicia where that refinery is a huge job center for that community. So how she's weighing, even though she's pretty liberal on a lot of issues, kind of fits pretty well within the existing Democratic caucus in Sacramento. This is one issue in which she might not vote for something that's an oil penalty or oil profit penalty or limits on refinery maintenance. You've seen this in some of the climate votes that have gone before the legislature. There are some Democrats who have held off voting on moving ahead with more ambitious climate goals because of kind of the makeup of their community, the jobs, the business of their community. One thing that's going to help Newsom on this is they've tweaked the terminology of what they're actually trying to do with this oil profits tax. They've changed the wording from a tax to a penalty. And just by virtue of that, they no longer have to get 2/3 of the vote in the legislature. So that was a little double change that happened at the end of last year. They reworded their proposal. Now it's a oil profit penalty, which means they could probably get this through with a majority vote. And given just the threshold, the margin the Democrats have in the Senate and Assembly, you might be able to do that without having any of those kind of moderate Democrats have to put themselves out there, have to, be pressed on the vote. You could largely do that with the existing progressives that Democrats have in their caucus. So I think that will be something to watch both in how those proposals move forward, whether there are more hearings. I mean, the legislature has tried to get oil executives to show up at hearings, to kind of explain what's the secret sauce behind why California is paying so much more at the pump than many other states, which is seems like a pretty complicated blend of our taxes and fees that we put on, oil fuel here in California, the decline in the amount of refineries that are here in the state, regulations we have on pipelines that make it harder to bring oil and gas in. So there been a few of those hearings and not a lot of clarity. And in the end, representatives for the oil companies have not even showed up to answer questions. So those are the kind of two things to watch in the special session. Is there more oversight? And then how well do those proposals actually bear out? Last thing I'll talk about is just some of the things on the local level. I'm based in San Jose, so largely my local coverage is around San Jose city government, things happening in the South Bay. And I'd love to also to hear, you all are very plugged in the South Bay and the peninsula. So if there's story ideas or things happening in your local governments, your communities that you think KQED should be watching or paying attention to, please let me know. Either talk after I'm done or shoot me an email, whatever, but please stay in touch with that kind of stuff. I mean, San Jose, we just had a mayoral election, as you all probably know, is a pretty competitive one. I think in many ways, like the animosity from that election has carried over into the new year with the new council. We saw a pretty bitter fight in December over how to fill 2 vacancies on the city council, whether to do that via appointment, which ultimately is going to happen, instead of having another special election to fill those vacancies in District 8 and District 10. So I think the job ahead for the new mayor, Matt Mahan, is to try to build some kind of consensus. It's a weak mayor system. It's not like San Francisco. He doesn't oversee departments. He doesn't veto or sign legislation. And he's joining a city council where I think only one current council member supported him during his run for mayor. So there's kind of the challenge he faces right away. There's a lot of discussion on his agenda on homelessness, on public safety, but I think from the very start, you have to look at it through the prism of like, he's only one vote. He's only going to go as far as he can in terms of being able to cobble together 6 votes on the council to get his agenda through. So that's what I'll be, watching in San Jose. Mahan took some early steps as far as his vice mayor appointment and some of the committee appointments to maybe have a little bit more of a conciliatory approach, appoint some folks who did not support him in the mayoral campaign. We'll see if that, wins over any new supporters. And there's certainly areas I think that the council can work together. There's, I think, a large consensus on police staffing and public safety and funding there. So the key thing to watch will be the March budget message. One thing the mayor actually does have a little more power over is the budget. The mayor gets the budget process started in San Jose with the March budget message. So seeing how Mahan addresses police staffing in the budget message, funding for shelter, emergency housing. And then I think more long-term, there was a huge debate within the mayoral race about the best way to be addressing homelessness. Cindy Chavez had really staked a lot of her reputation on building permanent supportive housing through Santa Clara County's affordable housing bonds. Matt Mahan largely made the argument that the city and the county government should be more focused on emergency shelters. I think honestly, for as much as airtime that debate got, and that was certainly, I hosted one of the mayoral debates, and that was a huge point of contention between the candidates. I think what was less discussed was how, no matter who won, was going to be able to win over residents and win community support for whether you're talking about affordable housing or shelter space. When I watched council meetings and new shelters or new affordable housing is proposed, especially these new interim emergency sites, you're hearing the same thing from residents. It's like, I really care about homelessness. I really want to be a part of the solution, but just not this place. Just not, this one is too close to my house, or this one is too close to my school. So in my mind, that's the challenge for the mayor. That's the challenge for the city council. Because in a lot of these cases, folks are organized. This is, when you're talking about development in someone's neighborhood, that's an issue that's very close to them. That's an issue that's going to be on voters' minds when they head back to the ballot in a couple of years. So being able to, gain resident support for these kind of developments, you saw in North San Jose, there's a huge, outcry from residents over one of the emergency shelters that was proposed. You had dozens of people showing up at the city council meeting. That's the kind of thing that can happen with these proposals. And so how Mayhan navigates that and be able to build public consensus around some of these projects will probably be the thing I'm most interested in watching over the course of the next year. And for Mayhan, it's a really short timetable. There was changes passed in San Jose last year to move the mayoral elections to presidential years. So he'll be back on the ballot in 2024. So what that means in practice is he basically has 14 months. He took office in January. The primary is now going to be in March of 2024. He has 14 months to show progress on issues like homelessness, public safety, cleanliness of the streets, etc. Which is a truncated timeline for any candidate, especially one with limited amounts of power at City Hall. So that's kind of what I'll be keeping an eye on in the next year ahead. There's no doubt more, politics, if I've learned anything, it's full of surprises, and you never know kind of what's going to pop up and dominate our agenda in the year ahead. But hope that was at least informative in terms of what I'm keeping an eye on. I'm happy to take questions on any of that or any other thing that you all are watching or interested in knowing about.
Now, that's real quick, if you do ask a question, if you can use your theater voice so that folks on Zoom can hear. And then Guy, you
And
can,
I'll try to repeat the question.
great, yeah, you can feel free to call on whoever.
Go ahead.
I am reading that Dianne Feinstein is starting to lose some of her mental acuity, and I was curious. I didn't know anything about it, so you got a comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not only behind the scenes. I mean, there have been some public reporting about kind of how, her mental acuity for management of the office. I would encourage, there was a story in the New Yorker by Jane Meyer last year that really was well sourced in terms of folks, working in the Senate, working on committees with Feinstein, even her staff, about kind of where she's at mentally. And I think that all is feeding into why you're seeing people not wait for her to jump into this race. I think the consensus among California's political class is that she is not going to run, that, she's been pretty stubborn about serving out the rest of her term. Health situations excluded. I don't see a situation in which she's resigning anytime soon. But I think all of that, what you're talking about, is why we're seeing so many candidates jump in.
Thank you.
Yes.
What do you think is the likelihood that the governor, the California Public Utilities Commission, or the legislature would start to hold PG&E more accountable for all these power shutoffs, wildfires they ignite?
That's a great question. So, what's the likelihood of the governor, the legislature, PQT holding PG&E accountable for power shutoffs, and I'll go a step further, the wildfires, the damages that we've seen too. I mean, I think even just getting moderate reform in that arena in 2019 was a huge lift. And I think if PG&E is a incredibly powerful group at the Capitol, I think has a lot of sway there. But I think also Democrats in Sacramento see PG&E as like the partner the state needs to hit a lot of our clean energy goals. So I think there's a recognition that, yes, PG&E needs to be held accountable for a lot of this stuff that's happening on the local level, but I think you've seen a lot of deference to PG&E in some circles in the legislature because, we're not going to get to the clean energy future that our state law is already prescribing without having this utility that's in many ways going to kind of lead that path in some ways when it comes to the grid. So I haven't heard a lot, honestly, on this for this year about that being a huge point of legislative agendas, like more oversight or more regulatory reform around PG&E. But I mean, I went without power for a couple of days last week. I think probably a lot of people did too around here. Like the public's patience with PG&E has been up for quite a while. So I guess we'll have to see how that transitions or how that translates into legislation or action at the Capitol. Yes.
Just to follow up on that point, How much support do you see in the public for making PG&E a publicly owned utility?
That's a good question. How much support do I see for making, in the public, for making PG a publicly owned utility? Honestly, I don't know. That would be something I would be interested to, I haven't seen any kind of polling or surveying around that. I mean, you have seen, there's been some cities, and I don't know how many in the Bay Area that have gone to their own
Santa Clara.
own power. I mean, I think the concern there is that, like, where does that leave the rest of the state? And where does that leave communities that, are dealing with wildfires and, cost to underground utility lines? Are you then creating just like a two-tiered system? But certainly more and more cities have gone in that path. But as it relates specifically to your question about public support, I don't have a good answer, but I would be curious to see if there is any polling on that. Yes.
So, I mean, having solar and seeing the change in the solar, the net energy metering, 3.0 basically guts your economics by 75%. Solar's dead after April 13th in the state. Why does the legislature see PG&E as a partner in clean energy? What PG&E is doing nothing for clean energy. I'm just curious why they see that as somehow,
Yeah.
other than clean energy meaning burning forests. I mean, I don't even see it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in terms of like their, their role in the grid and their monopoly basically in this region is why. But to your point, I mean, that was another extremely controversial move on the solar power that I was honestly surprised there wasn't more, back in the legislature or action taken in the legislature. The argument basically was that the existing rooftop solar system advantaged higher income residents, but in a lot of ways, I don't think it didn't seem aligned with what the state was putting out there as far as their goals in terms of energy transition. So yeah, I was surprised on that. And yeah, I mean, I think the PG&E thing is like the most high-profile political fight in recent years was over this inverse condemnation, kind of the responsibility that PG&E bears for wildfires, that many of which happens in our region. And even that was just a really kind of dragged out fight. Jerry Brown took that on at the very end of his second term. So I think anything relating to PG&E is usually a tough one. I think. Yeah.
So back to the homelessness issue, County of Santa Clara has a huge budget. I think it dwarfs San Jose. And yet all the attention seems to be about San Jose and what they're going to do with it. The state gives money to vote. What's going on there in terms of who should we be holding accountable? Our supervisors in the county?
I would say both. I mean, the state is setting a lot of the money. I mean, the homelessness is tricky because it touches so many different buckets. The behavioral health money, which is, goes into big programs like Care Corridor, that is largely coming down to the county. But the county in Santa Clara has kind of stepped into this role around housing that it, before the bond measure, it hadn't. So I think in terms of like holding accountable, they put themselves out there to be accountable for constructing this affordable housing. And I don't mean to say that it's just cities. I think Newsom and the legislature are looking at what, cities, counties, county consortiums, all kinds of local government when it comes to reduce homelessness, because you haven't seen the results. I think San Francisco was the only county in the Bay Area that saw any kind of decline in the most recent point in time count. So yeah, I think the attention and the oversight would be on both the city and the county. Yeah.
Quick follow-up. So money that's gone out from the state, is the issue that it hasn't been spent, or is it not spent wisely with good results?
Yeah, I think it's the latter. And specifically, I think what has frustrated what the Newsom administration says they're most frustrated about is they put in place a law last year that would require any city that's getting money to reduce homelessness to kind of put forward a plan on what would be the measurable results. And I think they felt like every city had a completely different blueprint of what success looked like. And in many cases, we're maybe setting pretty low bars on what, how much they would reduce homelessness. We heard anecdotal stories in places like Sacramento where their plan said, well, homelessness is still gonna go up, even with the money you've given us. We just maybe will make it go up by less. I think that's kind of the point of frustration when it comes to the administration, is not having kind of set goals across across the state. And it kind of honestly, it goes into this larger dynamic that's played out between state government and local governments around housing in general. I mean, the zoning, land use issues, the state government for many years had no involvement in that. Over the last half decade, that's probably been one of the biggest changes we've seen in Sacramento, is increasing, passing laws dictating both zoning reforms at the local level, how housing money is spent in cities and counties. Because I think in many ways, the state government has been pumping out money on this issue and without results. And so now they're trying to kind of put a little bit more oversight on that. But we'll see, in areas that the state has done this in the past, it hasn't always worked to great effect. I mean, education is a great example of this. The state, after Prop 13 took the large role in education as kind of property taxes and money went up to the state and then was kind of spread out to school districts throughout California. And what you saw was, as the state tried to put more and more oversight on what was happening in local classrooms, they ended up just passing more and more kind of categorical grant programs, so that no longer were they just giving money to schools and letting schools figure out how to use it best. They were saying for each different bucket of money, you need to go through a new application process. You need to hire people who know how to fill out the grants, this application process, and really created this Byzantine system of how schools were funded. It wasn't until 2015, 2016 that the state scrapped that and went back to just saying, we're going to look at one or two factors and give you a lump sum of money, school districts based on that. So this kind of stuff goes back and forth. The state gives money, they feel like not enough money, not enough results are coming. They put more restrictions on the money. Those restrictions might make it harder to spend the money and harder to get results, and then they lose their restrictions. So, we'll see how this plays out, I guess, over the next 5-10 years. Yes, sir.
I have a question regarding the sensitivity of the legislature and state in regard to climate change. We've been experiencing a drought for many years. We have the ability, we have the skills, we have the technology available to us to eliminate that problem. They stated in the documents that, hey, water is going to be the new oil. We use oil, we use gas, right? We transport enough of that in here to supply the needs of the community. If I develop a technology that allows me to evaporate the ocean, to condense it and bring it and have a station to offload it, similar to the oil industry. So we have the ability to do all of it. But then the legislature don't seem to have that forward-looking desire to really remedy our problem. I'm thinking and a lot of this is manufacturing because of the way money goes. So give me your view.
Is that desalination? Is that where you're going?
Well, yeah, desalination is an approach. That's just one approach, but it's a significant approach. The world is 2/3 water. So why are we dealing with a drought? It would seem to
I
me.
mean, it hadn't rained for years, but
What's that?
I mean, it hadn't rained in a few years. I think that's
But water is still there. It just changes state. I evaporate water, goes up to the temperature where density comes down the street. Hey, Mother Nature does it all the time. And so I'm saying, let's look at Mother Nature and how did she do it? Why can't we apply our skills and abilities that we have with us
yeah.
to accommodate things that we want?
It's a great question. I'm not a water policy expert, but I do think for some of the things you're talking about, desalinization, the major pushback that I've heard is just cost and setting up those. Go ahead.
It's simple. I think I get a ship. Okay, right? I put it in the ocean. And I have solar, heat, evaporation. And instead of letting it go all the way to Monterey, let's capture it in the ship. And then those that need the water, say, having the ship come by my station and dump the water, and I can put many of the ships in the sea without any significant impact, energy, generating energy, which is the biggest cost. That's what I mean about it.
Yeah, I mean, I do think this drought crisis we're in will, lead to some more out of the box thinking in terms of ideas. I mean, I was reading this week about the thought of, moving back levees around some of the larger rivers in California, opening up floodplains to kind of, recharge our groundwater. You might see some, I mean, that sounds outlandish because so many people live in those areas and are not going to be down to have their houses flooded, but I do think, yeah, you might see some more out of the box thinking. I think we are kind of going to be stuck in this situation because of the climate crisis of we're getting many dry years, and then maybe when we do get rain, it's coming like this. And so it might require some different kind of thinking of how we approach this last century, which was largely through the construction of dams, creating reservoirs. So hope springs eternal. I think there'll be, a whole new wave of thinking on this issue.
We have time for two more.
One question. Actually, I want to circle back again to the homeless population. Seems to look like America is the richest country on the globe, and California is the richest state in the USA. And Silicon Valley actually is the richest valley in California. What is the reason? What is the real cause? Why the homeless population actually is increasing? Any root cause?
I mean, there's, I think, a lot of reasons why we're in this situation with homelessness. I think, honestly, the lack of housing, lack of affordable housing is a huge one. The street homeless population that I think is the image we have of homelessness in our region is really a small slice statistically of who's experiencing homelessness. There's far more people who are just kind of living on the edge of not making their rent payment, who might be kind of in and out of homelessness, maybe living with family, living with friends, living in their car, going back to the apartment. I think, and that's directly related just to the lack of housing we have, the lack of affordable housing that we have. I mean, there's these areas, the Bay Area that we're in has resisted for a long time building housing, and I think we're seeing the manifestation of that in so many people who can't afford to live here. When it comes to the street homelessness and issues around severe mental illness, I think are a lot more complicated. For many decades, California locks those folks up. I mean, we had state mental hospitals up until the Reagan administration, where you simply just put people away that, is no longer acceptable in our society. So now we have to figure out, okay, what kind of programs and services do we provide that's kind of along the lines of whether you're talking about conservatorship, care court, Laura's law, ideas to address that specific population, which is, again, a really small portion of who's homeless, but is using a tremendous amount of public resources in emergency services and hospital visits. And that I think has largely gotten a lot of the focus of public officials. So just trying to separate like the different, I guess, categories or different kinds of causes, to your point, of this crisis.
It's not only the housing, I think, maybe there are many other issues involved inside there to resolve that kind of issue. So because it's not the city can work to do something to increase their income, because it's an income and an expense issues. Mostly whatever is the people is struggling, and even they have a house and the rental house, but might be tomorrow they don't have the money to be paid the rent, then they will have two choices: go to cheaper place or just go and sleep on the street. They have only two choices. City cannot do those kind of things and provide some kind of more assistance and then give them some kind of job training, skilled job training, that at least they can make them to be self-dependent, they can pay their own bill. even though we can lift up all the homeless at this point, provide them in a permanent housing or interim housing, whatever, or safe and secure shelter. But if how we can do that until they are not able to make the money themselves?
Well, I would say, I think the first step would be the housing, right? It's pretty hard to hold down a full-time job or get job training if you're still going back under the freeway at night. So I would say the lack of shelter in general, whether you're talking about, you know, permanent housing or even just a transitional or shelter or motel, that's largely at the crux of it. I think honestly, like for all of us living in this region, you know, we're right to put a lot of criticism and accountability on our elected officials and what they're doing. But I do think everyone has to ask, like, what are we willing to do to, you know, help with this issue? And again, I come back to anytime you're seeing a lot of these shelters or affordable housing be proposed in neighborhoods, it's very rare you see residents lining up to say, we're so excited to see this transitional housing, or so excited to see this emergency shelter come in our neighborhood. Every time those things get delayed, every time they get sent back to staff, oh, we're taking it back to staff, we're gonna, you know, do some more research to figure out how to make this work. That's just another night someone is not in, you know, sleeping with a roof over their head. So I do think there is, like, collectively up to the community, there's more that can be done. Obviously, it's a super complex issue, and I totally hear what you're saying about the, you know, job training and you know, building up both skills, but there's obviously, if it was easy, I guess it would have been fixed by now, as they say.
You're getting played off.
Big hand for Guy.